She was 9 months pregnant, standing barefoot on a wet driveway at 2:17 in the morning, holding a single suitcase while the man she married stared past her like she no longer existed, and the woman who raised him pointed to the gate and told her to leave before she embarrassed the family any further. And if that moment sounds cruel, it becomes something else entirely when you learn that less than 3 hours earlier, in a quiet conference room miles away, she had just finalized a transaction worth $50 billion, a deal so large it would quietly shift ownership across multiple industries, and the name signed at the bottom of every page, the name that would soon dominate financial headlines across the United States, was hers, the same woman now being told she had nothing, the same woman they believed needed them to survive. And by the time the truth surfaced, by the time the calls started coming in and the news alerts began flashing across their screens, the damage had already been done in a way that no apology could repair, because this was never just a story about money, it was about power, perception, and the dangerous cost of underestimating someone who chose silence over explanation. So before we go any further, before the full picture begins to take shape, ask yourself one simple question: how well do you really know the people closest to you? And more importantly, what if everything you believed about them was wrong? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because to understand how a woman with that level of influence could be dismissed so easily, you have to go back to where it all started, long before the headlines, long before the contracts, back to a version of her that very few people ever truly saw. A woman named Eleanor Hayes, who never needed attention to command a room, who built her life quietly, deliberately, and far away from the kind of noise that usually follows wealth. And when she met Daniel Carter, he saw something different in her, something steady, something grounding, and for a while, that was enough to make everything else fade into the background. But Daniel didn't exist in isolation, and neither did the life he came from, because the Carter family had its own expectations, its own image to maintain, and from the very first introduction, Eleanor was measured against standards no one ever explained out loud, standards she never tried to challenge, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't see the value in proving herself to people who had already made up their minds. And that quiet confidence, that refusal to perform, was the very thing that unsettled them the most, especially Daniel's mother, Margaret Carter. A woman who believed she understood people within minutes of meeting them, a woman who valued appearances, status, and control above almost everything else. And from her perspective, Eleanor didn't fit into the life she had carefully constructed for her son. She didn't come with visible wealth, she didn't speak about achievements, she didn't try to impress, and in a family where perception shaped reality, that absence of display was interpreted as absence of worth. And over time, those quiet judgments turned into subtle remarks, then into open criticism, always delivered in a tone that could be dismissed as concern, but carried something sharper underneath. And Daniel, caught between loyalty and comfort, chose the easier path more often than not, telling himself it was temporary, telling himself things would settle, not realizing that each moment of silence was slowly redefining the balance of his marriage. Because while Eleanor remained composed, continued to move through that environment without confrontation, there were pieces of her life they never saw, conversations they were never part of, decisions being made in spaces far removed from that house. And the more they underestimated her, the more invisible those pieces became, until the night everything surfaced in the most irreversible way possible, the night they believed they were removing someone insignificant from their lives, without realizing they were stepping away from the very foundation that had been quietly holding everything together all along. From the outside, Eleanor Hayes appeared to be exactly what Margaret Carter believed her to be, a quiet woman who married into comfort and simply adapted to the life provided for her, someone who moved through the Carter household without drawing attention, without making demands, and without ever correcting the assumptions placed on her. And for a long time, that illusion held, not because it was true, but because Eleanor never saw a reason to interrupt it. She woke early, kept to her routines, spoke when spoken to, and carried herself with a calm that many mistook for passivity, while Daniel Carter convinced himself that peace in the house meant everything was fine, that the tension between his wife and his mother was nothing more than a phase that would eventually fade. But what he failed to notice, what he never questioned, was how little he actually knew about the woman he had married, how often she stepped away to take calls she never explained, how frequently she traveled under the simplest of excuses, how her world seemed to extend far beyond the one he thought he had given her, and it was in those unnoticed gaps that Eleanor continued to build something far larger than anyone inside that house could comprehend, something that required patience, precision, and above all, silence, because in her world, visibility was never the goal, control was. And every decision she made was leading toward a moment that would eventually intersect with the very people who believed. She had none, and still, she said nothing, even as Margaret's comments became sharper, even as the environment around her grew colder, even as the distance between her and Daniel became something that could no longer be ignored. She didn't defend herself, she didn't argue, she didn't reveal, and that restraint, that decision to let them continue believing what they wanted, would become the very thing that made what happened next so devastating, because by the time the truth began to surface, it wouldn't come as a conversation, it would come as a consequence, one that neither Daniel nor Margaret Carter were prepared to face, and one that would force them to confront a reality they had spent months, even years, refusing to see. Eleanor Hayes had always understood something most people never take the time to learn, that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one in control, and that real influence often moves quietly, without announcement, without the need for validation. And that understanding shaped every part of her life long before she ever met Daniel Carter, long before she stepped into a family that measured worth by what could be seen and displayed, because Eleanor came from a world where discretion wasn't just a preference, it was a requirement, where deals were not discussed at dinner tables and success was never something you explained, it was something that revealed itself only when necessary, and for her, that moment had simply not come yet, not because she wasn't capable, but because timing, in her world, was everything. And so while Margaret Carter continued to question her, continued to chip away at her place in the family with carefully chosen words, Eleanor remained steady, never reacting in the way they expected, never giving them the confrontation they seemed almost eager to receive, and over time, that lack of reaction created a dangerous assumption, the belief that she had no power to respond at all, and Daniel, whether out of comfort or avoidance, allowed that belief to settle into something permanent, convincing himself that Eleanor's silence meant acceptance, that her patience meant dependence, and that whatever tension existed would eventually resolve itself without his involvement. But what he didn't realize was that every moment he chose not to speak, every time he let his mother's words go unchallenged, he was slowly removing himself from a part of Eleanor's life that he didn't even know existed, a part that was growing, expanding, and moving towards something that would soon become impossible to ignore. Because while the Carter household operated within its own narrow view of reality, Eleanor's world extended far beyond it, into boardrooms where decisions shaped markets, into conversations that determined the direction of entire industries, and in those spaces, she was not quiet, she was not overlooked, she was precise, respected, and absolutely in control. And on the day everything changed, on the day that would later be remembered not for what happened inside that house but for what happened outside of it, Eleanor sat at the head of a long conference table surrounded by people who understood exactly who she was, people who didn't need explanations or introductions, people who had spent months working toward a single outcome, a deal so complex and so significant that it required complete discretion until the very last signature was placed. And when that moment finally came, when the final document was slid in front of her and the room fell into that familiar silence that precedes something important, Eleanor didn't hesitate. She reviewed the page, picked up the pen, and signed her name with the same calm certainty that had defined everything she had done up to that point. And just like that, the deal was done, $50 billion, finalized without announcement, without celebration, just a quiet acknowledgement among those who understood its impact. And within minutes, the room shifted, conversations resumed, hands were shaken, and plans began to move forward. But Eleanor didn't stay. She didn't linger in that moment the way others might have. Because for her, it wasn't the end of something, it was the completion of something that had been set in motion long before anyone in the Carter family ever questioned her place in their world. And yet, just hours later, that same woman, the one who had just concluded a deal that would reshape entire sectors, found herself standing outside in the rain, holding a suitcase, listening as Margaret Carter made it clear that she was no longer welcome, that whatever role she had once held in that house was over. And the contrast between those two moments, the distance between who Eleanor was in that boardroom and who they believed her to be in that driveway, could not have been greater. And still, she said nothing, she didn't argue, she didn't reveal the truth that would have instantly changed everything, because by then, it no longer mattered. The decision had already been made, not just by Margaret, but by Daniel as well, in his silence, in his refusal to step in the way he allowed that moment to unfold without interference, and Eleanor understood something in that instant with complete clarity, that whatever connection had once existed between them was no longer something she needed to hold on to, and so when she turned and walked away, when she stepped out into the rain and left that house behind without looking back, it wasn't out of defeat, it was out of resolution, because the life they thought they were taking from her was never something she depended on to begin with. What happened next didn't unfold all at once, it came in pieces, small realizations that slowly built into something undeniable. It started with a notification, a headline that appeared on a screen, one of those financial updates that most people glance at without much thought, except this one carried a name that Daniel Carter recognized immediately, a name he had seen written countless times, a name he had never once associated with anything beyond his own home, and at first, it didn't make sense. It couldn't, because the scale of what he was reading didn't align with the version of Eleanor he thought he knew, and yet there it was, clear and undeniable, connected to a deal that was already being described as one of the most significant in recent history. And as more information surfaced, as more details began to fill in the gaps, the reality became impossible to ignore. The woman they had just forced out of their lives was not who they believed her to be, not even close, and the implications of that realization extended far beyond embarrassment or regret, because as the full structure of that deal became clear, so did its connection to everything the Carter family had built, connections that had never been explained, dependencies that had never been questioned, until suddenly, they were impossible to overlook. By the time Daniel tried to reach her, by the time the first call was made and went unanswered, it was already clear that something irreversible had taken place, not just in their relationship, but in the foundation of everything he had taken for granted. And Margaret, who had always been certain in her judgments, who had never once doubted her ability to assess a situation correctly, found herself facing something she could neither control nor undo, because for the first time, the assumptions she had relied on had led her somewhere she couldn't navigate, somewhere that required an understanding she didn't have, and as the weight of that realization settled in, as the full scope of what they had lost became impossible to deny, one thing became clear above all else: Eleanor Hayes had never needed them, not for stability, not for status, not for anything they believed they were providing, and the moment they chose to push her away was the moment they removed themselves from something far greater than they had ever understood, something that would continue to move forward without them, unaffected, unchanged, and completely out of their reach. The silence after the calls went unanswered was the kind that doesn't just sit in a room, it presses in, it forces questions that can't be avoided, and for Daniel Carter, every passing minute began to feel heavier than the last, because the more he replayed that night in his mind, the more he realized how little he had actually understood in the moment, how easily he had allowed something permanent to happen without fully grasping what he was losing, and now, with fragments of the truth beginning to surface, those moments didn't just feel like mistakes, they felt like decisions he could never take back, and while he struggled to piece things together, Margaret Carter moved in a different way, not with confusion, but with urgency, because even without fully understanding the situation, she recognized one thing immediately: influence had shifted, and whatever position they thought they held was no longer secure, and that realization didn't come from emotion, it came from patterns she had spent years observing, the kind that signal when control is slipping, when something unseen begins to reshape the ground beneath you, and for the first time in a long time, she was not the one directing the outcome. As the hours passed, more details emerged, not through direct explanation, but through the systems Eleanor had been a part of, systems that did not pause for personal conflict, systems that continued to move forward regardless of who understood them or not, and with each new piece of information, the picture became clearer. Eleanor Hayes was not just involved in the deal, she had been central to it, a key figure whose decisions had influenced its direction from the very beginning, and the implications of that went far beyond reputation, because tied to that deal were assets, partnerships, and structures that extended into areas the Carter family relied on without ever realizing the source. And now, with Eleanor no longer present, those connections were shifting, not dramatically at first, but enough to create uncertainty, enough to disrupt what had always felt stable, and Daniel began to see it in small ways: delayed responses, subtle changes in tone during conversations, Opportunities that no longer seemed as certain as they once were, and while none of it was immediately catastrophic, it was enough to signal that something fundamental had changed. Margaret, however, saw it faster and more clearly, because for her, control was not just about what was visible, it was about what could be anticipated, and this was something she had not anticipated, something she could not trace back to a decision she had made, and that lack of control created something unfamiliar, a hesitation, a need to reassess, and for someone who had always been certain, that hesitation carried its own weight, because it forced her to confront a possibility she had never considered, that she had misjudged Eleanor Hayes entirely, not just in small ways, but in a way that altered the entire outcome of her actions, and that realization did not come all at once, it built slowly, with each unanswered call, with each new headline, with each quiet confirmation that the situation was far more complex than she had allowed herself to believe. Daniel tried again to reach Eleanor, not with the confidence he once had, but with something closer to urgency, leaving messages that grew less certain with each attempt, messages that shifted from assumption to realization, but there was no response, not because she hadn't seen them, but because there was nothing left to say. The moment for conversation had already passed, and Eleanor had made her decision the same way she had made every other important decision in her life, quietly, without announcement, and with complete clarity. And while Daniel searched for a way to fix what had happened, Eleanor was already moving forward, not in reaction to them, but in continuation of what she had already set in motion, because for her, that night was not the defining moment of her life, it was simply the moment when two separate worlds finally stopped overlapping. In the days that followed, the full scale of the situation became impossible to ignore, not just for Daniel and Margaret, but for those around them, as conversations shifted, as questions began to surface, as the connection between Eleanor Hayes and the deal became common knowledge in circles that mattered, and with that recognition came a new understanding, one that reframed everything that had happened inside that house, turning what they had seen as a dismissal into something far more significant, a separation from a source of influence they had never acknowledged, and while no one said it directly, it was clear in the way people responded, in the way opportunities adjusted, in the way the Carter name no longer carried the same certainty it once did, not because it had lost everything, but because it had lost something essential, something that could not be easily replaced or restored. Margaret, for the first time, was forced to sit with the outcome of her own decision, not in a moment of confrontation, but in the quiet understanding that there would be no reversal, no conversation that could return things to the way they were, because Eleanor Hayes was no longer part of their world, not by circumstance, but by choice, and that distinction mattered, because it meant the door was not just closed, it was removed entirely, and for someone who had built her life on control, on shaping outcomes, that finality carried a weight that could not be negotiated, and Daniel, caught in the space between what had been and what could no longer be, came to understand something far too late, that the woman he had stood beside, the woman he thought he understood, had always been operating on a level he had never taken the time to see, and by the time he realized it, by the time he fully grasped who Eleanor Hayes truly was, the opportunity to stand beside her in that reality was already gone. And Eleanor, moving forward without hesitation, without the need to look back, stepped fully into a life that had always been hers, a life defined not by what others believed about her, but by what she had built, what she had protected, and what she had chosen to reveal only when it mattered. And in the end, there was no dramatic confrontation, no final exchange of words, just a quiet, undeniable truth that settled over everything that had happened, that sometimes the greatest power is not in proving people wrong, but in allowing them to realize it on their own, long after the moment to change it has passed. And by the time Daniel Carter and Margaret Carter truly understood the depth of their mistake, Eleanor Hayes was no longer within reach, not emotionally, not personally, and certainly not in the world they had once believed she depended on, because the truth was, she never did. And what made it harder for Daniel Carter to process wasn't just the scale of what Eleanor Hayes had accomplished, it was the realization that there had been signs all along, small, quiet moments that now replayed in his mind with a clarity he didn't have before, the late nights that never came with complaints, the calls she stepped away to take without explanation, the calm way she carried herself even when the atmosphere around her became increasingly uncomfortable. None of it had seemed unusual at the time because he had never thought to question it. never thought to look beyond the version of her that was easiest to accept, and now, those same moments felt different, not mysterious, but deliberate, like pieces of a life he had been standing next to without ever truly stepping into, and that distance, that gap between what he thought he knew and what was actually true, became the hardest thing to reconcile, because it wasn't created overnight, it was built slowly, through assumptions, through silence, through the choice to not look deeper when it would have mattered most. Margaret Carter, on the other hand, approached it with a different kind of focus, one that moved past disbelief and into calculation, because for her, understanding Eleanor was no longer about curiosity, it was about consequence, and the more she examined the situation, the more she began to see how thoroughly she had misread it, not just Eleanor's position, but the structure surrounding her, the network of influence that had existed entirely outside of her awareness, and that realization forced her into unfamiliar territory, a position where reacting was no longer enough, where the usual strategies of control and persuasion had no clear application, because Eleanor Hayes was not someone who could be managed through pressure or expectation. She had already demonstrated that in the most definitive way possible, by walking away without hesitation, without negotiation, and without leaving any indication that she intended to return. Days turned into a stretch of time that felt longer than it was, not because of what was happening externally, but because of the internal shift that neither Daniel nor Margaret could ignore, the way their environment no longer felt as stable as it once had, the way conversations carried an undercurrent of uncertainty, the way decisions that used to feel straightforward now required reconsideration, and while nothing collapsed all at once, the sense of security they had relied on was no longer absolute. It had been altered in a way that couldn't be immediately fixed, and at the center of that change was the absence of someone they had dismissed as insignificant, an absence that now felt larger than her presence ever had, because it came with the understanding of what she had actually been contributing all along, quietly, consistently, and without recognition. Daniel made one final attempt to reach her, not out of habit this time, but out of something closer to clarity, a recognition that whatever he had failed to see before was now impossible to ignore, and in that moment, the message he left was different, not filled with assumptions or expectations, but with an acknowledgement that came too late to change anything, because even as he spoke, even as he tried to find the right words to bridge a gap that had grown too wide, there was an underlying understanding that the outcome had already been decided, not by circumstance, but by a series of choices that could not be undone, and when there was no response, when the silence remained exactly as it had been, that understanding settled into something final. Eleanor Hayes, meanwhile, continued forward with the same precision that had defined every step of her journey, not accelerating, not hesitating, simply moving in alignment with what she had already built, and in the world she operated in, the deal she had closed was not the end point. It was a transition into something larger, something that required her full attention, her full presence, and there was no space in that movement for revisiting what had already been resolved, because from her perspective, there was nothing left unfinished, no conversation left incomplete. The moment that defined her relationship with Daniel Carter and Margaret Carter had already passed, and it had been clear in its outcome. What remained was not a dramatic collapse or a sudden reversal, but a shift in understanding, one that extended beyond just the three of them, because as the story of Eleanor Hayes became more widely known, as her role in the deal became part of larger conversations, it began to reshape how others saw similar situations, how assumptions were made, how easily people dismissed what they did not immediately understand, and while her name carried weight in professional spaces, it was the contrast between her public position and her private experience that stayed with people, the idea that someone could operate at that level and still be reduced to something so small in the eyes of those closest to them. Margaret Carter eventually reached a point where there were no more strategies left to consider, no more angles to analyze, only the outcome itself, and in that outcome was a lesson she had never intended to learn, that certainty without understanding can lead to decisions that cannot be reversed, and for someone who had spent so much time shaping the direction of others, being left with something she could not change was not just unfamiliar, it was defining, because it marked a boundary she could not cross, a situation she could not reframe in her favor, and that realization remained long after the initial shock had passed. Daniel Carter carried it differently, not as a calculation, but as a reflection that continued to surface in quiet moments, in the absence of what had once been there, in the awareness of how easily something important had been overlooked, and for him, The lesson was not just about Eleanor, it was about perception, about the danger of assuming that what you see is all there is, and about the cost of not asking deeper questions when it matters most, because by the time he understood the answers, they no longer belonged to him. And Eleanor Hayes, having moved beyond that chapter without the need to revisit it, remained exactly who she had always been, someone who did not rely on recognition to validate her position, someone who did not need to correct every misunderstanding, because the reality of what she built, what she controlled, and what she chose to walk away from spoke with a clarity that no explanation could improve, and in the end, that was the only thing that truly remained, not the moment she was asked to leave, not the assumptions that led to it, but the undeniable fact that the person they underestimated had never been defined by their perception of her, and by the time they realized it, that truth was no longer something they could be part of. In the weeks that followed, the story of Eleanor Hayes didn't just remain within boardrooms or financial circles, it began to travel, quietly at first, then with increasing attention, not because of the money involved, although $50 billion was enough to turn heads on its own, but because of the contrast, the almost unbelievable gap between how she was treated in her own home and who she actually was outside of it, and for many people who came across it, the detail that stayed with them wasn't the deal, it was the image of a woman, 9 months pregnant, standing in the rain, being told she had nothing, while holding more power than anyone in that moment could even comprehend, and that contrast made people pause. It made them question how often situations like this exist without being noticed, how often people are reduced to assumptions simply because they choose not to explain themselves. For Daniel Carter, the passage of time didn't bring closure, it brought clarity, and clarity, in this case, was heavier than confusion had ever been, because it left no room for excuses, no space to reinterpret what had happened in a way that made it easier to carry. Every detail remained exactly as it was, every moment still leading back to the same point, the night he chose silence when it mattered most, and that silence became the defining line between what his life had been and what it would now become, because while nothing around him collapsed in a dramatic way, something far more significant had shifted internally, a recognition that the most important decisions are often the ones that don't feel like decisions at the time, the ones where doing nothing is still a choice, and for him, that understanding would stay long after everything else had settled. Margaret Carter faced a different kind of reality, one that didn't come with a clear resolution or a way to regain control, because the situation she had created was not one that could be negotiated or corrected, it existed as a fixed outcome, something she had to accept without being able to reshape it, and for someone who had spent years believing she could read people accurately, that she could anticipate outcomes and position herself accordingly, this was something entirely different, a moment where her certainty had led her in the wrong direction, and the consequences of that were not external or temporary, they were permanent, embedded in a decision that could not be undone, and over time, that understanding settled into something quieter, less reactive, but no less significant, because it marked a boundary she had never encountered before. And Eleanor Hayes, having fully stepped into the life she had already built, continued forward without interruption, not driven by what had happened, but by what had always been in motion long before that night, because for her, the defining aspect of the story was not the moment she was asked to leave, it was the fact that she had never needed to stay, that everything she had, everything she controlled, everything she had worked toward, existed independently of the space she had been removed from, and that independence, that separation, was what allowed her to walk away without hesitation, without the need to explain or justify anything to people who had already decided who she was. In the end, there was no confrontation, no final meeting where everything was laid out and understood, just a quiet separation between two realities that no longer intersected, one built on assumptions that had been proven wrong, and one built on decisions that had never required validation from the outside, and the distance between those two realities remained, not as something dramatic, but as something definitive, a reminder that the way we perceive people is often limited by what we expect to see, and that sometimes, the greatest mistake is not in what we do, but in what we fail to recognize while it's right in front of us. So when you think back to that moment, to the image of Eleanor Hayes standing in the rain, being told she had nothing, it becomes something more than just a scene. It becomes a question, one that doesn't come with an easy answer. How many times do we misjudge the people closest to us? How often do we assume we understand someone without ever really looking deeper? And if you were standing in that same position, if you were Daniel Carter in that moment, watching everything unfold, would you have seen what he didn't, or would you have made the same choice, and only understood it when it was already too late? And years from now, long after the headlines about the $50 billion deal have been replaced by newer stories, newer names, newer numbers, there is one detail that will remain, not in financial reports, not in corporate summaries, but in the memory of a single moment that quietly defined everything, a moment that never made the news in full, never carried the weight of what it truly meant, a moment where Eleanor Hayes stood outside a house she would never return to, holding a suitcase, carrying a child, and walking away from people who believed they were the ones in control. And what makes that moment stay with you isn't just what she had, it's what she chose to leave behind without hesitation, because most people, when faced with that kind of misunderstanding, would try to correct it, would try to explain, would try to make themselves seen, but Eleanor didn't, and that choice, that refusal to prove anything, is what separates perception from reality in the most undeniable way. Because in the end, this was never just about wealth, it was about awareness, about how easily people assign value based on what they can measure, what they can see, what they can control, and how often they miss the truth simply because it doesn't present itself in a way they expect. And for Daniel Carter, that truth didn't arrive as a sudden revelation, it settled slowly, in quiet moments, in the absence of something he once had access to but never fully understood. And for Margaret Carter, it remained as a fixed point in time, a decision that could not be revisited, only remembered, and in both cases, the outcome was the same. The realization came, but it came after the moment where it could have changed anything. And Eleanor Hayes, by then, had moved far beyond that night, not because she needed to escape it, but because it had never defined her in the first place. It was simply a moment where two paths separated permanently, one that continued forward with clarity and control, and one that remained behind, shaped by a choice that could not be undone. And that is where this story truly ends, not with confrontation, not with revenge, but with distance, the kind that forms when understanding arrives too late to matter. So when you think about this story, when you picture that night, that rain, that silence, ask yourself something honestly: how often do we underestimate people simply because they don't explain themselves? And if you were placed in that same moment, if everything depended on what you chose to see or ignore, would you recognize the truth in time, or would you, like Daniel Carter, only understand it after it was already gone? And if this story made you think, let me know in the comments what you would have done differently, and where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, because stories like this don't just show you what happened, they make you question how often it could happen again.